A few years ago, I was driving on a freeway in Atlanta. It was early on a Sunday morning. I was actually going to pick up a friend who was in town who was going to speak at our church that morning. And I still remember it was a very quiet morning. I was driving mostly by myself. It was very peaceful. And as I was driving along, I look up into my rearview mirror moments before a drunk driver rear ends me going 120 miles an hour. I don't know if you've ever been in an accident like that or have been rear-ended, but it's such a surreal feeling knowing as I looked into my rearview mirror what was about to happen, but with no ability to do anything to change it. And I still remember the violent feeling of this car crashing into me. Now, thankfully, the driver hit me pretty dead on. I could only imagine what would have happened if he would have hit me at any form of angle. But this crashing happens, this disruption happens, and my adrenaline suddenly kicks in, disorientation all around me. And as I was trying to figure out what had just happened and what do I do, obviously the first thing is I pulled over to the side of the freeway in my rearview mirror. I remember watching this car, once it hit me, crash into one side of the median, go all the way across the freeway, crash into the other side of the median. It's amazing how many thoughts are going through my brain at the exact same time. The first thing I'm thinking about is, what just happened? Am I okay? Is my car okay? Oh my gosh, I have to go pick up my friend. Who's going to speak? Who's going to go pick up my friend? How's this going to happen? Oh no, is that driver hurt? I was fearful that potentially he could have lost his life. And thankfully, both of us were able to walk away from this accident. But I still remember the flood of thoughts that happened in that moment. And what I didn't realize at that exact moment that I came to learn later is that I had received a major concussion. And I don't know if you've ever experienced a significant concussion like that, but it was such a wild feeling. I remember I had to hold on to things to find my balance. I would try to say things and words wouldn't come out as I intended. I would start sentences and not finish them. There was a radical disorientation to things that were so normal inside of me. I still remember as the police officer that came onto the scene and was taking my statement, I was standing there having to hold onto my car, trying to tell him what had just taken place and the frustration inside of me because I knew in my thinking what had just happened and I knew what I was trying to say to him, but my words weren't coming out the way they were supposed to. I was in this disoriented state and it was so incredibly frustrating because it was something that I felt like internally I could have some kind of victory over, that what I knew on the inside, I was having trouble producing it on the outside. And I didn't realize that this concussed state I was in was limiting my ability, and it was so frustrating. I believe that we are in a cultural moment of disorientation. I believe we are in a cultural concussed moment. And supernaturally, spiritually, when we find ourselves in such a state of disorientation, it often feels like what happens when we are experiencing that in the physical. We know who we are. We know what we believe. We know the things that we hold inside of us, but suddenly we have this trouble getting it out of us. We have to depend on things we didn't used to depend on. The things that we used to take for granted, the things that were once so normal, suddenly they're more difficult than we assumed. We have words to say, but they don't come out right. We don't know how to speak. We don't know how to act. The truth is, friends, we are in a moment of disorientation. We are in a moment of concussion. And if we do not know who we are as followers of Jesus, who we can build our foundation on, who we can lean into, how we can walk through this season, we'll not only find ourselves frustrated and unable, we will find ourselves turning towards false solutions, false paradigms, and false realities. I am convinced that this is an hour where we as followers of Jesus not only must understand what's happening around us, but what has happened to us. And in this disorientation, what are we going to hold on to that reorients us back to who we really are? Today, I have a very simple word in my heart for you. This word from James that I believe is a prophetic word for you as a church, a stirring church, about orienting yourself in disorientation, about understanding who you are in a concussed world and a concussed reality, about actually going, what does it mean to follow Jesus in the midst of the fray? What does it mean when life has become frayed, when the edges are blurred, when things are disoriented? How do I move into the promises and the future of what Jesus has for me? Not only how do I figure this out as an individual, but how do I, along with my brothers and sisters, be the church on mission that we have been called to be? And I have something that I believe is a key for you that I want to take just a few minutes and put into your hearts. Jesus has this incredible teaching in Mark chapter 8. I believe a teaching that has profound importance that we as a church have minimized. A teaching where he's with his disciples and he talks about a yeast of the Pharisee and a yeast of Herod. The context here in Mark chapter 8 is Jesus has just performed this incredible miracle of provision of food. They're back in this boat and the disciples are having this conversation about recognizing that they haven't brought enough food onto the boat and they're trying to figure out what to do. And right in the middle of this, Jesus speaks in and he says this word. He goes, beware the yeast of the Pharisee and beware the yeast of Herod. The disciples actually do not have eyes to see or ears to hear. They don't understand what's happening in the moment. They're not thinking about anything spiritual. And actually, in the wake of Jesus' statements, they just go, oh no, is Jesus upset? Did we not bring enough food? What are we going to do? And they continue to talk about the situation that was at hand, missing the power of what Jesus was actually saying to them. Look here in Mark chapter 8, how Jesus responds. He says this, they discussed with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? They were confused by Jesus' confusion. Verse 17, this is what happens. It says, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketful of pieces did you pick up? 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? Do you still not understand? And I am convinced that this is a moment where Jesus is leaning in, trying to speak a deep and profound spiritual truth. And like the disciples, we're caught on the wrong conversations. And Jesus is coming in and saying, hey, do you not understand what I'm trying to say to you in this moment? You think I'm talking about bread. I'm not talking about bread. I'm talking about who do you place your trust in? Think about Jesus as a rabbi uses this incredible tool, which was common in Jewish thinking about symbols and numerology. And he says, in this miraculous provision, how many basketfuls were left? 12, they replied, which is the biblical number for the people of God, the community of God. 12 always represents the nature of the people of God. And he says, and remember when I provided for the 4,000, how many basketfuls were left? And they talk about 7, which is the number representing God's perfect rule and reign. You say, do you not understand that the only one who is safe to care and provide for God's people, the only source you can trust is the rule and reign of the kingdom for your life. And this warning, beware the yeast of the Pharisee and beware the yeast of Herod. I believe Jesus was trying to communicate to his disciples that in your life, in their lives, and in our lives, there are these 2 incredibly powerful forces that will live throughout culture for the rest of time. The spirit of the Pharisee and the spirit of Herod. And when you are not rightly anchored in Jesus for who you are and how he's leading your life, what will happen is you will automatically default to one of those 2 forces, to one of those 2 currencies of life. And Jesus is looking at his disciples and saying, there is only one place you can trust, not only for your identity, but the very source of your life. And it is not in the spirit of the Pharisee, and it is not in the spirit of Herod. It is in me. And this is a moment where we as followers of Jesus, in our disorientation, in our concussion, in this frayed reality, so many of us are not looking to Jesus to be the source and the anchor of who we are. And what we don't recognize is that by default, we are choosing either the spirit of the Pharisee or we're choosing the spirit of Herod, which is the spirit of the world. Because this is what happens when you're disoriented. You're going to grab hold of something to stabilize you. We must be those who find all of our identity, foundation, and stabilizing in the person of Jesus, in the power of Jesus, in the ministry of Jesus, and in the gospel of Jesus, which is the gospel of the kingdom. This is what he has put inside of us. And I say this out of a warning to you. You cannot find your heart stabilized in the spirit of the Pharisee. You cannot find your heart stabilized in the spirit of Herod. You can only find your heart stabilized in the spirit of Jesus. And listen to this line that he says to them. Do you have eyes but fail to see? And ears but fail to hear? I believe many in the church, while they could see, they don't see. And while they could hear, they don't hear. Because in this moment, they found their foundation outside of something actually than the substance of Christ. And we need to be those who actually see with the eyes of Jesus, who hear with the ears of Jesus, so we can have the power of the Spirit-led leadership and wisdom of Jesus, so that we can live and lead our lives into what he has for us. We need this. And I believe it is James, the brother of Jesus, who in the beginning of his wisdom epistle speaks to this reality of how do we actually find ourselves safe, oriented, stabilized in the person of Jesus, so that in this frayed world, we can not only walk with him, but bring the transformation and the power of Jesus into everything that we say happening. Listen to what James says. James 1:1-8. Let me read this to you. James says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded in all they say and do. Isn't it interesting how James starts this letter? Why I believe it is a profound and prophetic word to the church in this moment, to the scattered, to the frayed, to the broken, to the disoriented. I have a word for you. James is writing to this diaspora, this dispersion of Messianic Jews who have been flung all throughout the Roman Empire. This phrase of scattering was a name that they carried, but it was more than a geographical reality. Their scattering was emotional. Their scattering was spiritual. Their scattering was cultural. Their scattering was the very reality of their lives. And I think there is something so profound that when James writes to them, he addresses them as the scattered. Is that not what so many of us feel? Is that not what has happened in our lives? Is that not what quarantine has produced? A scattered and frayed reality within us? And here, James has a word to the scattered. And listen to what he says in verse 4. This invitation he has for us. He says, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. Other translations use the word perfect. Perfect. What we actually miss is this word that gets translated as mature, as perfect, is this Greek word teleos. And the actual understanding of this concept is not perfect how we would understand it or mature how we understand it. It's a very specific kind of identity in the kingdom, which is called whole. It's talking about a wholeness. It's talking about a flourishing of every single part of your life, you functioning to the fullest extent of who you really are and who you are supposed to be. Do not miss the power of what James is actually saying. To the scattered, I have a promise for you. And that promise is wholeness. This is what Jesus is trying to say to us. To the scattered, I have wholeness for you. Do you not know that? Do you not know what I'm trying to do? Do you not have eyes to see and ears to hear what I'm saying to you in the middle of this moment? In your scatteredness, in your brokenness, in your fraying, I have wholeness for you. And this is this radical promise of Jesus that James is trying to bring to us, and why he can start with this wild statement. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of any kind. My guess is the most unlived out verse in the New Testament. That there is actually a promise of Jesus that somehow in the midst of the struggles and the hardships of our life, we can take a posture of joy. But the reason we don't take a posture of joy is because we don't actually understand what James is trying to tell us. That what he's actually saying is that when you find yourself in these places, these scattered places, these frayed places, there is something that God is trying to do in your life. And if you would actually understand what God was trying to do in your life, then you would actually be able to receive what he's trying to do in your life. And when you receive what he's trying to do in your life, joy will come. There really is a promise here that we as followers of Jesus can say alongside James, yes, I can consider it pure joy. Yes, I can come alongside of that. And even for us, when we read that, the phrase consider for us, isn't it such a maybe word? Well, why don't you consider blank? Here's an idea for you about suffering. Maybe you could consider joy. And most of us are like, well, James, nice thought, no, but thank you. That's not going to be my consideration. For us, we translate the word consider as actually such a possible idea, a maybe idea. Well, if my other options don't work, maybe I'll go to James' suggestion. But that's not actually what James is saying at all. That translation for us, it misses something, because what James is trying to do here in the Greek, what he's actually saying to us is he's saying, I have a first and leading thought for you, a primary thought by which everything else I'm about to tell you hangs upon. And if you don't get this first thought, the phrase that we translate consider is not this something of suggesting this maybe. He's actually saying, you've got to understand this. I have this leading thought for you. And if you put this leading thought in its priority, everything else will fall in its way. He's not telling us a maybe. He's telling us you've got to anchor your life in this. And if you anchor your life in this, then you can actually receive all of the implications from it. James' first and guiding and preeminent thought about walking through fraying, about walking through scattering, about walking through disorienting seasons is that there is a radical joy that is possible to you if you walk it out with Jesus. You have to walk it out with Jesus. My wife and I, we've been married 17 years in a couple of weeks. And I remember we had a moment in 2008, which was probably one of the more difficult seasons of our marriage, where like many marriages, you just kind of have seasons where you weave in and out, and you recognize your immaturity and the way you're living your life isn't cultivating intimacy. And I remember this was about 5 years into marriage, and there was this really sudden realization for Emily and I, especially as pastors in ministry, that we had become so busy, that we had given our lives in so many different directions. We had not stewarded intimacy with each other, and there was a division that was growing between us. And we are the kind of people who just believe that there is a profound gift in the right counselors. You get around people that are filled with the Spirit, that are lovers of God, that are gifted and knowledgeable and talented. They can come alongside of you and actually produce incredible things in your life. And Emily and I, in this realization, began to meet with a counselor who was such a gift of God in our life. And there were patterns. We got married so young. There were some patterns in our marriage we didn't realize, and how we were disconnecting emotionally. And we genuinely found ourselves in this place of significant disconnect. And I'll never remember this moment at one of the sessions with our counselor, where he was looking at us and he said that the thing that you don't understand, he was speaking specifically to me, it was, Phil, the thing that you don't understand is every time a problem enters into your marriage, whether it's small, whether it's big, whatever it is, that you have adopted this position that now suddenly there is this thing in between you and Emily. That like, just even like this table, that I'm here on this side and Emily's on. As soon as a problem enters into our marriage, this problem is between us and there is no intimacy that can be experienced until this problem is remedied and taken aside. And he goes, you have faulted and foolish thinking. He goes, what you have to understand about marriage is not intimacy if. So many of us live in our marriages intimacy if. And we let problems come between us, and intimacy can't be fully restored until this other person has to deal with this reality that I no longer like in my life. But he said the key to marriage is actually recognizing that that is a false equation. It is never you versus your spouse with a problem in between you. What you have to learn how to do is come around to the other side of the table and unite with her, and it is you and her versus the problem. And he said, when you learn the art of this, it'll transform your marriage. And it has. Our marriage has never been the same. And since Emily and I realized it was always us as one flesh versus anything that we faced. Problems from us or problems from the outside coming in. We are a united team. And I almost say that because I feel like what James is trying to say to you, what I want you to catch when he's talking about this idea that there is something happening in this scattered world where you can consider it joy when you face trials of many kinds, because God is doing this work in your life that you can have faith and believe and not doubt, not be tossed to and fro. He's simply saying, do you not know the first thing you need to do is you've got to get on God's side of this problem. You have to make the decision that in the middle of these moments, in the middle of these frustrations, in the middle of these circumstances, you have to get right on God's side of the problem. Because when you get on God's side of the problem, as a united team, there are things that are going to happen that are going to change and transform your life. I am absolutely convinced of this, that you have to get on God's side of struggle. I believe that so much of the pain and so much of the confusion and so much of the damage that happens in believers' lives is because when trials or temptations, when problems enter in, when struggles, when hardships come into people's lives, they face them alone and speak a spirit of accusation back at God, rather than immediately going, oh my goodness, a trial has just come into my life, a temptation, a hardship, a struggle. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to walk across the side of the table and I'm going to get on God's side of this problem. Because when we get on God's side of a struggle, we see it through his eyes, we hear it through his ears, and we walk with a supernatural power. What is this supernatural power? Well, here's the key in what James says, right? He says, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that this testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And here he uses these three Greek words. I know where the sermon this morning is like going to Greek school. I want you to catch this. He uses these three Greek words, parasmos, dokomion, and hupomeneo. And he says, when you face these trials, these parasmoses, you are going to go through this testing, this dokomion, which isn't a testing like we think of it. We think of it like God judging us. And that's not actually how the word is structured. It's actually saying a tested result, almost like a piece of pottery you put into a smelter, that when you walk through trials, something is going to happen and it's going to produce a tested result, a product in it. And there's something about that tested result that is going to lead to this hupomeneo, which is this supernatural endurance. And see, what James is trying to say is you can consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face these parasmoses of any kind, these trials of any kind, because you recognize that when you get on God's side of a struggle, then suddenly as you walk through these situations, what's going to happen is this trial is going to become tested. This parasmos is going to come dokomion. It's going to have a tested result. And what you don't understand is in that tested result, God is going to put into your life. He is going to supernaturally intervene, and he is going to put this supernatural endurance, this supernatural ability for you to bear a hard load, this thing called hupomeneo that you actually now have in your life. And once you have this in your life, then you will be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Then you will find this wholeness. So this promise to us is that actually as we face these unique trials, that if we get on God's side of a problem and we are actually willing to go through suffering with him, then in the midst of this suffering with him, as this trial becomes this tested result, as this parasmus becomes this dokimion, as this thing, this smeltering takes place in our lives, God is going to infuse it with a supernatural endurance. And why does this matter? Because actually this supernatural endurance, this hupomeneo that God wants to put inside of you, is the key ingredient that God partners with to bring wholeness into your life. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. We're talking about your marriage. We could be talking about your children. We could be talking about your work life. We could be talking about anything. You want to know the key to wholeness? Endurance. A supernatural endurance that God puts inside of you when you get on God's sides of struggles. Because in the midst of getting on God's side, in the midst of walking through trials, in the midst of walking through a disoriented season, this scattering, God is actually going to meet you and he's going to put something in your life that is required. Because can I tell you what I know? Before COVID, before all the racial injustice that broke out into our world that was on our screen, but before March, can I tell you what you were aching for? You were aching for wholeness. Can I tell you the dream of your life? Wholeness. Can I tell you what you were made for? Wholeness. The real desire of who you are is to walk in a life of wholeness with God, wholeness in flourishing, and wholeness in the kingdom of God. And Jesus is trying to say to you, do you not understand? It's in moments like this. It's right here, right now, that something is happening, that if you get on the side with me, I will meet you in the middle of these trials and I will put something in your life that is the ingredient that is required for you to become everything that you're supposed to be. So yes, you can consider it joy. Not because you have some foolish or naive expectation about how hard things are, but in the midst of hard things, you go, oh no, I get it. This is the environment. This is the moment. This is the kind of place where God infuses into my life something so profound, something so supernatural that it is actually going to unlock the keys to my heart and the keys to my future. The promise of wholeness is executed through the gift of endurance. And the gift of endurance is given to those who get on God's side of struggles and suffer alongside of him. And then James, he says this, he says, if any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave at the sea blown and tossed by the wind. And here he gives us this second key. Not only do you need to get on God's side of the problem and allow him to do this work of endurance, he talks about coming to God with faith. And here I think we read this, I actually don't think James is talking about existential crises. I think he's talking about a hardness of heart, where we would actually posture ourselves in belief towards God, but not believe he's going to come through for us. And so we bounce back and forth between options. Trust God, don't trust God, trust God, don't trust God, trust God, don't trust God. And our lives become unstable, swinging back and forth like waves. And what we miss is that when we hear this word faith, we immediately read it in our very Western Greek thinking, talking about an intellectual idealness, but it's not how faith was thought of for the Jewish people, nor is it clearly how faith was thought of for James. James actually believes faith, rightly lived faith, is not just lived out in your thinking, it's lived out in your lifestyle. That he's actually, when he's saying you've got to come to God with faith, what he's actually saying for us and the way we would understand it. Yes, you have to come to God with belief. You have to come to God with faith, but you have to come to God with faithfulness. When he's saying you got to come to God and believe and not doubt, He's actually saying, are you giving God a faithfulness in your life for him to work out this wisdom? You see, what I've learned for so many people, they come to God and they go, God, give me faith. I don't know what to do in this situation. Give me wisdom. I don't know what to do in this situation. But they have no faithfulness to actually allow God to meet them and intervene those moments in your life. What James is trying to say is if you want to receive what God is trying to do in your life in this season that will actually produce this radical wisdom, which, by the way, your Father wants to give you so badly. Don't you love the Father heart of God here in James? Your Father who loves you and gives generously to all and doesn't punish anyone for lacking wisdom. You come to him and you go, God, I need wisdom. And is that not what we're saying? God, we need wisdom in this hour. James would say, if you give him a road of faithfulness without a hard heart, then he will give it to you. And here it is in these two things, these simple principles so many of us leave behind, that it is endurance and faithfulness which posture us in the place where God can bring us to wholeness. I would tell you, I think the greatest problem that Christians face is they want the promises of Jesus without the ways of Jesus. They want the life of God without the walk with God. And if you actually want to live a life that is going to go towards wholeness, especially in this moment, if we are going to be the kind of church on mission that brings wholeness to the world, can I tell you what's required of you? Endurance and faithfulness. These two things are how God leans in and partners with us to bring everything he's trying to do in the world. My alarm, I should end. That's what the alarm is telling me. Let me close with this. Endurance and faithfulness is the way of Jesus that leads you to the promises of wholeness. I, over the last several weeks, wanted to teach a different word. In fact, I wrote a sermon I didn't end up speaking this morning. But I couldn't shake that this was something that was in me for you. Because as a friend to Stirring Church, I love you. As Nate, who's one of my closest friends, this burning desire in my heart simply to speak a word of truth to you. We are in a scattered moment, and you will stay scattered. You will bind yourself to a false spirit of a Pharisee or a false spirit of the world if you do not orient yourself in Jesus. As his great teaching on the Sermon on the Mount says, he who builds his foundation on him, on Jesus, on his life and his teachings, will be able to weather any storm. But those who build their life on the sand, the storms will come and their house will be torn down. Storms are coming. Storms have already come. More storms are coming. Your life will not only stay whole, but become more whole when you build your life on the only one who can make you whole. And it is a season where we need to give everything in our hearts and our minds to allow God to do this work of endurance and faithfulness. Why? Because he has a dream of wholeness for us. And these are the ways that he produces that. God wants to make you whole. But if you don't let him teach you endurance and you don't let him teach you faithfulness, there is no way you'll ever find the wholeness that you were actually made to experience. Come on, let me pray for you. Jesus, we love you. And Father, I just come to you and say we desperately need your aid and your help. This is an hour where we need your wisdom like none other. Please, Father, come and meet us. Lord, I covenant to you that in the midst of these trials of all kinds, I am going to be the kind of person that immediately comes into my oneness with you and says, what are you saying? What are you doing? I'll face anything with you. I'll go wherever you go, Lord. As long as your spirit goes with me, I will go wherever you go. May you do this in us. May you produce this life in us as a church. Come and bless the stirring. In Jesus' name, amen.